Class is now in session. I am Professor Hockey, and today we're discussing Game 44 of the regular season for the San Jose Sharks as they took on the Utah Hockey Club and lost by a score of 2-1. And honestly, this was a very disappointing outing for the San Jose Sharks, not just for the obvious reasons that they lose this game, they give up the late go-ahead goal, they don't play particularly well, but more so than that, this was a matchup against an opponent who I really thought that the Sharks would be able to get up for and really bring a certain level of energy to tonight's game because of what happened in the two previous matchups between these two teams. Going all the way back to the end of October, the Sharks actually got their first win of the entire season against Utah. They came into that game on a 9-game losing streak, were very much in danger of extending it to a full 10 games, double digits, just as they hit a couple of times last year, but instead they managed to pull off a miraculous third period comeback, ending it off with an overtime win, and that in a way put their season back on track. Obviously they still haven't been particularly good since then, but they certainly have been better than they looked in those first 9 games. Then in the second matchup against Utah, not only do the Sharks actually end up losing in embarrassing fashion like tonight, where they give up that late go-ahead goal in the last minute or so of the third period, but also Utah was taking a lot of liberties in that game. It was a physical, chippy, and honestly a little bit dirty game as well. Elbows, cross-checks, hits from behind, especially onto Macklin Celebrini, where emotions were definitely boiling over that night, so much so that even though this next third and final matchup would be taking place about a month later, I thought that the Sharks would have it circled on their calendar, that they would want to come out here tonight with a lot of energy to attempt to get some revenge on a team that, like I said, was willing to take a lot of liberties last time. And yet what we ended up getting here tonight was instead a preseason level of energy from the San Jose Sharks, as though they didn't even really care about who they were actually facing off against. And that, as I said, very disappointing to see. At least in the game a few days ago against the Vegas Golden Knights, there was a modicum of effort from San Jose, but they were just kind of shut down by a team that was significantly better than them, and they couldn't handle the size, the speed, or the skill of the Vegas Golden Knights. Here tonight, I don't even want to say that Utah was actually all that good. Obviously, they were better than San Jose, but they weren't playing exceptionally well. It was the Sharks kind of beating themselves in a way by just not really showing up to play. The type of game that it felt as though neither team really deserved the full 2 points. But it's just that the Sharks, basically gave it away to Utah anyway. It didn't actually start that way, however. In the first, basically, shift of this game, Fabian Zetterlund does get the Sharks on the board. This is the fastest goal that the Sharks have scored all season long, and you're thinking this is a strong first step for the Sharks to assert themselves here tonight and really take it to Utah, even though the Sharks are the road team. But this was the only bright spot for San Jose this entire game. The rest of the first period would pass with maybe 1 or 2 chances for the Sharks. Meanwhile, Utah would pile on a bunch. First, it's Clayton Keller, who somehow barely misses the empty net just a few minutes after this Zetterlund goal. Then there's a couple of posts hit. Then there's a Nick Bjugstad breakaway. Utah, with a bit more luck for themselves, probably could have had a 2-1 or maybe even 3-1 lead in that first period. The second rolls around and the Sharks do not look any better. In fact, they look a good bit worse, just as they did in the second period against Vegas the other night. And it is only Utah who manages to finally get their game-time goal, and it is a 1-1 game heading into the third. You're thinking at that point, the Sharks haven't really played all that well in those first 40 minutes. They'll come out with a response in the third period. But honestly, not really. The Sharks basically get very little chances as well in those final 20 minutes, maybe like a good shift here or there, but it comes down to the last couple of minutes of this game, and it is Barrett Hayton who finds the go-ahead goal, this time not on the power play like it was in their previous matchup, and that puts Utah ahead 2-1. The Sharks, they try to pull their goaltender right away with about a minute and a half left, and then what ends up happening is that Kevin Stenlund, who was at the center of a lot of that drama, I guess, in the previous matchup, he ends up taking a 4-minute high-sticking penalty. He hits Eklund right in the face, draws blood, but because this puck is not whistled down on the penalty, but instead is whistled down on the injury, Eklund cannot come out for the immediate next shift. So the Sharks set up 6-on-4 with Eklund on the bench. They've got Granlund, they've got Celebrini, Toffoli, Wenberg, Zetterlund, and then they've got Will Smith. And what ends up proceeding is that the Sharks do win the face-off. This puck works its way eventually to Will Smith, and then what ends up proceeding proceeding to happen is that about 16 seconds get killed off the clock as Smith passes it between himself, Granlund, and Toffoli. Never a play really opening up, and then eventually Smith looks for the pass back to Granlund. It gets intercepted, it gets called off on the offside, and while this doesn't end the game for the San Jose Sharks, it does kind of kill some of that momentum. And the reason I bring this up is because it would be very easy for me to sit here and blame Will Smith for this, and honestly, he does deserve some of the blame. Very stagnant play, and he makes the giveaway in the end that ruins this chance for the San Jose Sharks. But I also have to criticize the other 5 players out on the ice. This is not just a power play. They also have the goaltender pulled. You have 2 players extra on the ice. And I've talked about in the past how with a power play, what you want to have is options. You want to be able to have 2 to 3 options at all time to be able to pass to, because it creates a lot of uncertainty for the penalty killers, and that causes them to retreat a little bit. But when those options don't actually open up, it allows the penalty killer to be significantly more aggressive and actually challenge the puck carrier. That's exactly what happens here with Will Smith, and it puts him into a tough spot. Why is Toffoli just sitting there at the goal line barely moving? Why is Granlund doing the same? Why is all of these players on the ice are just standing in their one spot, and they're putting a ton of pressure onto Will Smith, saying that he has to be the one to make that pass? And again, you can blame Smith for sure for not making a better play than he did, but I think a lot of blame does also have to rest on the rest of the Sharks players who are just not making it an easy time for him. So it just feels as though a squandered 6-on-4 situation, and that lets this game expire, and was really just a small microcosm of the real issues for the Sharks throughout much of this 60 minutes of this game. Moving on to the players to talk about, we have the Sharks' top line of the Lunds, Eklund, Granlund, and Zetterlund. They were the Sharks' best line of the night for sure. It's not saying much. I don't think they were incredibly dominant, but they were definitely better than what anything of the other 3 lines did show. But we also kind of got to see a bit of a weakness of the Lund line, which is not anything with the 3 of them themselves, but it kind of exposes a little bit of the lack of depth, especially with a couple of the injuries that the Sharks do have at forward that they have right now. Because outside of Macklin Celebrini, these 3 Lunds, these 3 players are the 3 other best forwards for the San Jose Sharks. So having them on the same line together, it creates a bit of a kind of a tough spot for the other 3 lines. And so they really have to carry the brunt of the offense. I've mentioned this multiple times in the past this season. And so while I think they did some good things, you probably would have liked to see a little bit more. When it comes for Fabian Zetterlund, he was a game time decision here tonight, but he didn't really look it. I actually thought he was probably the Sharks' best player on the ice. Not only does he manage to score, but I thought he brought some energy here. He was playing fast. He was playing physical. One of the very, very few players who actually managed to stand out in a positive light here tonight, so I'll give him credit there. When it comes to Eklund, it was a game that was, I will say, worse than the one a couple of games ago when he returned to the lineup against New Jersey. It was better than the one the other night against the Vegas Golden Knights, but it was just kind of a middling performance that you would have liked to see a little bit more from. I do appreciate, however, the fact that he takes that high stick. He's bleeding out on the ice pretty much, I believe out of his nose, if I'm not mistaken, but he gets patched up right away, and he wants to come right back out. That's the type of winning mentality that you do want to see out of a player. And we also got to see some creativity out of him as well. There was that nice spinorama move. He was holding the puck decently well in the offensive zone, so it certainly wasn't a bad game from Eklund. He was still one of the Sharks' better forwards, but again, you are looking for a little bit of a raised level of play. And then the very same criticisms have to go with Mikael Granlund. He picks up this primary assist, but it's still a situation here for Granlund where, just as it has been for the last month and a half, really honestly ever since he took that hit up high from Ilya Lyubushkin against the Dallas Stars, we're just not getting enough, or at least as much as we were getting from him earlier this season from Mikael Granlund. So it was a good game for the Lund line. I don't want that to be misconstrued here, but could you be looking for a little bit more? I would say so, especially with how much the Sharks have been struggling offensively over these last few weeks, if not this entire season. Then when it comes to the Sharks' second line, we have Celebrini and Smith kept together as that duo, but instead of playing with Colin Graf, they're instead put with Luke Cunnin. Now, it's definitely one of those things that kind of gets that innate reaction out of you to be up in arms about such an inclusion, but I wonder if the reason Cunnin finds himself on the second line is not because of they really wanted to promote him, but perhaps as a kind of a deterrent because of what happened in the Sharks' previous matchup against Utah. Because those liberties were taken, they play someone who's a bit more physical, willing to stand up for his teammates like Cunnin on this line with their 2 young talents. it's possible. It didn't actually lead to anything here tonight because, again, this was a lifeless game where you wouldn't have even known that there was any sort of rivalry between these two teams, that anything would have happened in the previous matchup. But maybe the reason for that is because Cunnin was on the second line, so it's kind of hard to go which way. How he actually worked out here on the second line, it didn't, I would say. Cunnin, I don't think, had a particularly effective game. But unlike in previous times where Celebrini and Smith have been played with guys like Barclay Goodrow, it didn't really feel as though it was like Cunnin's fault per se. Obviously, he didn't help the line all that much. He didn't really do much. But at the same time, it's not as though Celebrini and Smith were working it so exceptionally well, but then when it finally reached Cunnin's sticks, the play would just completely die. He didn't help. He didn't hurt. He just didn't play very well. Because that brings us to the other two players, and we'll start off with Macklin Celebrini, who in my previous review of the Vegas Golden Knights game, I talked about how the grind of the NHL season could have perhaps been getting to him. He hasn't played this many games. In college, you play 40-odd games. There's not as much travel. There's not as much back-to-back over and over again. And Celebrini, you were kind of hoping for a little bit of a bounce back here. You were wondering if maybe Warsofsky would wean off a little bit and give him a little bit more ice time, but that's very clearly not an approach that Warsofsky or Celebrini is going to take at this point, or at least didn't here tonight. He gets close to 20 minutes yet again. It felt as though he was playing a ton, almost every other shift in that third period, even in a tie game. It'd be one thing if the Sharks were actually chasing and trying to get the game tying goal, but the fact that this was already a 1-1 game for the majority of this one since that goal was scored in the second period to tie it up from Schmaltz, it was a little bit odd. I would say, not odd, but it's telling, I would say, that Celebrini was getting as many shifts as he did, which is to say that I don't think it's necessarily fatigue that is a problem here for either Celebrini or Warsofsky. Doesn't seem to think that as well. It's just perhaps a little bit of a cold streak that does hit every single player that has ever come into the NHL. Even looking at previous first overall phenoms, we go back last year to Connor Bedard. There was a stretch near the end of December and early January where he himself also only had 1 assist over a 5-game stretch, similar to how Celebrini right now has just 1 goal over a 5-game stretch. Going back to Connor McDavid in his rookie season, it was a stretch, I believe, in March, mostly because he missed a good chunk of the season with an injury. He went about 4 games with just 1 assist over that time. So as an 18-year-old, other teams are going to finally be able to kind of get used to what you're doing. There's a lot more tape out there. They know how you're finding success in the NHL, and they're now trying to adapt against that. And it's about Celebrini's job of being able to adapt against that as well, and who can kind of win that arms race. Hopefully Celebrini will be able to find his game back again, because here tonight it wasn't great. Again, he is the type of player who can still set up some chances. He has that talent where even when he's not playing very well, so we saw that in the opportunity in the second period where he feeds Toffoli in front. He set, I believe it was Cunnin up for a strong breakaway opportunity in the third period. So there was some things, but realistically a pretty weak outing for him. And then when it comes to Will Smith, honestly a very similar game to the one he had the other night against the Vegas Golden Knights, where Smith actually ends up being the leading shooter for the San Jose Sharks here tonight. They had very few shots on net, and yet Smith had 4 of them. He's getting the looks, he's getting the opportunities. I wouldn't say they're high danger, but more from like that medium danger area. But we saw with the Utah Hockey Club here tonight, both the Schmaltz and Hayton goal weren't like exceptional chances from very much in close or right in the slot, but from relatively far out, top of the face-off dot type of thing, where Smith is getting a lot of these shots from. So my point here is that eventually once Smith gets a little bit more confident, he's not flubbing these shots as much, and is actually getting a bit more accuracy here, these will probably start to go in. So there is some credit for Will Smith for actually being able to find those looks on net and doing what very few Sharks were actually able to do here tonight, which is get shots on goal. But generally, I wouldn't say it was a great game for Smith anyway, so yeah, there's that. Then when it comes to the Sharks' third line, I'm going to talk about Toffoli and Wenberg kind of bundled here together, because there was a very telling quote the other night after that Vegas game from Ryan Warsofsky, where one of the reporters asked him what he felt though about the energy that the Celebrini line was able to bring in that Vegas game. And what Warsofsky said was that he felt as though that they shouldn't have to rely on an 18-year-old to actually bring the energy, and that everybody on that team should be able to play at a higher level throughout a game. And this really gets you thinking of, indeed, that is absolutely the case. Celebrini is an extremely dynamic player, but having to constantly rely on your 18-year-old rookie to really bring that high level of energy when you're supposed to have brought in these veteran type of guys to be more of a consistent output type of player like Wenberg and Toffoli, it's a little bit disappointing when instead they have had these incredibly spotty performances all throughout this season. Toffoli himself, it feels as though half of the games this year have been good. Half of the games he just really hasn't done much of anything. Tonight was more so in that latter category. Toffoli was not doing much. Defensively, I didn't really appreciate his effort. Offensively, there was almost nothing outside of that one chance generated by Macklin Celebrini. It just feels as though Toffoli, it's not as much of an impact. And the fact that you have brought him in to be that type of role model, and I'm not going to comment on anything of what has happened off the ice. I know from what has been said that Toffoli has done a good job with both Smith and Celebrini with being that type of leader type of player. But when it comes to the actual on-ice product, the message, when you look at someone like Will Smith and you say, yeah, he's a little bit inconsistent. One game he's really good, one game he's really bad. Well, it's like father, like son here, because Toffoli very much has that same exact approach. So you want to be able to see more of a consistent level of play from your veteran guys who you were hoping to get that from when you brought them in. And the very same criticisms exist for Alex Wennberg. He's been reliable this season. He's had some decent moments. He's potted some important goals for the San Jose Sharks. Speaking of that first win of the season against Utah, he had the overtime game winner, but there's also been so many games this season in which I have just been kind of average about my feelings of Alex Wennberg, when you were hoping he would step up in a little bit more of an active way, where even if he's not scoring, he could at least be impactful on the game, and that just doesn't happen enough. When it comes to the third player on this line, Colin Graf, kind of a similar game, not to the previous one against Vegas, but his first two this year in the NHL, where he's playing a solid game. He's been all right, but there's not a ton really to get excited about from a Colin Graf perspective. I would not be upset to continue to see him in the lineup, and considering the Sharks continue to just pile up on the injuries here tonight, we'll get to that a little bit later, Graf will almost certainly hang on to this spot, and hopefully he can get a bit more going offensively, but I can't really blame him too much tonight because his two line mates were not doing much. And then when it comes to the Sharks' fourth line, I mentioned an injury. That one was to Klim Kostin. He played just about 3 minutes here in the first period. He did not return for the second period. I don't think this was a huge blow for the Sharks because I don't think Kostin was playing particularly well up to this point, but it does make it so that the Sharks dropping to 11 forwards does have to create more of an ice time burden on those other players. When it comes to the two other players on this fourth line, when it comes to Barclay Goodrow, the one event of this game that really hangs over his head that kind of makes me unable to see anything else was this huge mistake in the first period where Mukhamadullin jumps up into the play. He's up aggressively. You're expecting Goodrow to cover back for him in the neutral zone, be that defensive player. And then for whatever reason, it's not even like seemingly in a 50-50 puck battle or anything, but Goodrow steps up extremely aggressively, no reason, which leaves Bjugstad open for this breakaway chance. This is like a egregious, very obvious mistake that if like Will Smith made that, he'd be demoted to the fourth line. But with Barclay Goodrow, obviously I don't know what's happened behind the scenes. Maybe he did get a stern talking to, but he's right back out for the very next shift. It's a huge mistake that you're not expecting your consistent veteran to be making at this point. It was definitely really, really bad look. And again, as I mentioned, it really hangs over the rest of anything that Goodrow actually did here tonight to make me think that he did have a bad game. And when it comes to Ty Dellandrea, he has been out of the lineup a decent amount lately. You're thinking he'd be able to step in and make more of a difference. And while at the very least he doesn't take a penalty, which has been somewhat of a commonplace thing for him as of late, he didn't really do much of anything either. Defensively for the San Jose Sharks, it was actually an all right night. As I mentioned, Utah themselves weren't that great, and you have to give some credit to the Sharks defense for being able to limit some of the major high danger chances that they were able to get. And we'll start off with that top pairing of Thrun and Ceci. I'll actually point out Cody Ceci, who I really, really liked the first half or so of this game. The latter half, I think he disappeared a little bit more, but he was still solid defensively. But in the first half, he was stepping up extremely aggressive offensively. He was joining the rush. He was pinching down in the wall to keep pucks alive. He's probably been one of the better offensive defensemen for the San Jose Sharks. It's kind of funny to say that because you wouldn't expect that from a Cody Ceci, but since Jake Wallman got down from injury, there really haven't been many players stepping up on the back end in that way. So seeing Ceci actually attempting to make that happen is nice. He actually does pick up the secondary assist on this Zetterlund goal. It was a really nice pass. It was probably a set play off of the faceoff. This is something they likely have practiced before, and so maybe that is why he was able to have the vision to find Granlund in this position, but still, it was executed well. It worked out for the Sharks. It got them their only goal of the game, so credit to Ceci where it is due. When it comes to Henry Thrun, the other player here, not quite at the same level of Cody Ceci, but I liked some of the confidence that Thrun did show here tonight. He slowed things down. He didn't just rely on trying to get pucks off the boards very, very quickly, and as such, creating turnovers or I guess giving the puck away, I should say, in his own zone. It felt as though he showcased a bit more patience, which was nice to see. So an all-right game for Thrun. When it comes to the Sharks' second defensive pairing, Liljegren and Ferraro, there wasn't a ton to get very excited about from either of these two players. But at the same time, I actually thought Ferraro played relatively solid. He also didn't have too many of these really bad giveaways, as has usually been the case. And Liljegren, there wasn't a ton offensively, but there weren't some huge mistakes. There was one I think I noticed defensively that was really bad, but besides that, can't be too upset. And then when it comes to the Sharks' third defensive pairing, Mukhamadullin draws into the lineup yet again over Marc-Edouard Vlasic, so I was still continue to be surprised by this. I thought Vlasic would be playing more games. I don't hate it, as I do, of course, love that the Sharks are trying their younger defensemen. It's just surprising to me that Warsofsky would be going in this direction. Mukhamadulin's a very interesting player. I have seen some, I guess, feeling of him being a timid player on the ice, when in fact I actually think it's very much the opposite. Outside of that first game when he jumped up into the NHL this season, where he was he kept it very simple, recently he has actually been a lot more aggressive. He steps up very aggressively. He tries to challenge players. He's making these risky type of plays. We saw that here tonight, the spinorama at the offensive blue line, deking players out on the oncoming forecheckers that could have been potentially dangerous. He steps up in the neutral zone to try and interrupt plays and end plays before they actually start. So I like the aggression that he is showing at times. Obviously, there are occasionally moments in which he does get burned a little bit because of this, and players are able to get behind him and get decent chances, and that was indeed the case here yet again tonight. But I like the elements that he has shown. I like the confidence that he has shown, and so, as I mentioned, while I do think, it's a surprise that Vlasic hasn't gotten more games, I certainly can't be too upset about it because I've enjoyed Mukhamadullin's time in the lineup. And then finally, we do have, or actually I should talk about Jan Ruda, who I didn't think had a particularly great game here tonight. Not completely horrible, but you go back to at least the goal that Utah seemingly scored at the beginning of the third period. This was a one that ends up getting called off in a very obvious goaltender interference. I was surprised this even standed in real time, and this replay probably should have just taken a couple of seconds instead of the minute or so it did, because again, extremely obvious. But Jan Ruda makes the mistake in this type of situation that allows this goal to have even happened in the first place. So I wasn't a huge fan of Jan Ruda's game here tonight. And then when it comes to Alexander Georgiev, it's hard to be too upset with what Georgiev did. He only lets in the 2 goals, so he's gone from 4 Giev to 3 Giev and now 2 Giev here tonight. At the same time, both of these goals were definitely ones he could have potentially made the save on. So I wouldn't say he's completely off the hook, but he was definitely extremely far from being the Sharks' worst player of the night. He gave a good enough performance for the Sharks to be able to get the win. He had some high danger saves that were necessary to keep San Jose alive. And so he's been better as of late in these last couple, but the Sharks in front of him have not. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action tomorrow. They'll be taking on the Minnesota Wild back in San Jose. So a brief 1-game road trip before now they head back for a brief 1-game homestand. And Askarov will be playing the next game. And for whatever reason, it seems as though the Sharks play significantly better in front of Askarov than they do in front of Georgiev, even when Georgiev is actually putting on a pretty good effort. So we'll see if the Sharks can respond and get back into the win column, because their last couple of efforts really haven't been it. Class dismissed.